Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. This is the March edition of our monthly iMap Invasives webinar, and this month we're focusing on the invasive species tiers. So this is prioritization of invasive species driven by iMap data and expertise from the PRISMs primarily. And so today we have Jennifer Dean from the New York National Heritage Program, as well as John Thompson from the Catskill Regional Invasive Species Partnership, and also Catskill Center. So Jen will give a background and introduction on what the tiers are and where they came from. And then I'll give a quick status update for 2024. And then John agreed to tell us how the tiers are leveraged in the Catskills. And then at the end, I'll talk about some online resources for the tiers. And if anyone has any questions throughout the call, please feel free to enter those into the chat box. And we might answer some of them as we go, but we'll also have some time at the end to answer questions. And so I guess at this point, I'll pass it off to Jennifer Dean.
All right, great. Thanks, Mitch. All right, so here in New York, we're all pretty lucky to have invasive species coordination and funding and so forth in the PRISMs. The PRISMs have been an amazing way that, New York State is handling the, prevention of invasive species and education of residents about invasives and also treatment and management. And the PRISMs the concept of the PRISMs have been around for quite a while, and I think it was 2013 that we all celebrated because all the PRISMs were then had funded contracts and so forth. And so, we started thinking more about like how we coordinate our work and so forth. And in 2016, we took a look at the different ways that the PRISMs are, say, like prioritizing the species that they're working on. And, a quick look through all the websites and so forth, that we had many different ways of prioritizing and explaining how our prioritization was occurring in the different regions of the state. And so this is, kind of a snapshot in time from, gosh, like 8 years ago now, of all the different, lists and ways that the PRISMs were referring to their priority species that, where their work was focusing. And so at the time, Steve Young was our New York National Heritage Program botanist, and he was also coordinating the LISMA PRISM, and he and I were talking about this and decided that it would be great if there was some type of standardized framework. Of course, the species that, say, LISMA is dealing with are very different than the species that APIP might be dealing with, but a framework to define what those species are would be a good way of getting everyone working on the same page. And so, another consistent feature between all the PRISMs is that we're all working in this general framework of the invasion curve, right? And I know many of you have seen this time and time again, where we're showing the generalized growth of an invasive species from the time of introduction, and as the time increases, that area infested, and of course the control costs are also increasing. And so we took these general concepts of the invasion curve and assigned categories, these tiers to them. And so tier 1 being that prevention phase before introduction, tier 2 being a population has been introduced but perhaps small enough to eradicate still, tier 3, eradication may no longer be feasible, but it's something that containment might be possible. And then tier 4 are species that are well established and, have high impact, but are impossible to, eliminate from the landscape, but may be controllable at a localized scale for specific asset protections. And so we, kind of stole these concepts and decided that we needed a way to use these phases of the invasion curve into a set of definitions for these invasive species tiers. And so right off the bat, so looking at like the impact of the species, we decided that just focusing on the high or very high species was the way to go, because we already have enough of those to be dealing with. Things that are a lower impact or unknown at this point were not put into this tier definition. And then, but we did have a category for species that we really don't know, that's tier for monitoring, tier M, species that just need more research, mapping, and monitoring to understand their invasiveness. And so this is the simplified set of definitions, but we really did put a lot of thought into this. Some examples for this, we have, like, say, feral swine would be a tier 1 species, so it's not known to be in the PRISMs anymore due to eradication efforts from the state and federal agencies. And then an example of tier 4 are things like Japanese knotweed or Bohemian knotweed that are well spread across the landscape. And then within tier 2 and 3, you know, sometimes that gets a little trickier to distinguish between, but kudzu may be an example, say, an eradication for certain regions of the state. And then tier 3 are things that possibly could be contained even though they cannot be eradicated. And we did assign much wordier definitions as well to these, and this is available from our website. And, you know, so these, we wordsmithed this quite a bit with the Invasive Species Network, so CEC and the PRISMs and AgriMarkets, so like try to land on, you know, the wording that would make the most sense for creating these regionally specific species lists. And so, you know, setting up this framework of definitions is one step, but then another step is, you know, can we apply some type of data-driven methodology to creating these tiers in the first place? And so we took a stab at this by creating what we called the data tiers. So, you know, just looking at the presence data alone, you know, like all those iMap records and so forth, how would the data place species into tiers? And so we did this based on the data that's available in the New York State invasiveness rankings. But of course, the data never tells the full picture, right? There's a lot of local and taxonomic expertise. So experts then look at this data breakdown to produce finalized tiers. So there's both this data-driven component and the expert review process. And this process is run for each PRISM, so 8 times, using that data specifically for that PRISM, and then also at the New York State scale. And one thing that's been nice about this process is as we, you know, get more and more years behind us of experience in tiering, that we kind of have more of a feedback loop. So, you know, many times there's data gaps. Experts within a region might know that a particular species is, say, a tier 2, but if it's not documented in one of the databases, like iMap invasives, then we won't be able to catch that the next time we run the data analysis. So we have this feedback loop with the tiers resulting in, you know, more data gaps filled. And a lot of this data-driven approach was led by our ESF master's student, Dylan Finley, a few years ago. And so he really did a lot of data wrangling to try to figure out the best way to get these data tiers created, and then a more standardized expert review process. And that's written up in Biological Invasion. So you can get more details about the methodology there. And just diving into a little bit more detail about the information that we're using. So for these data tiers, we assembled a huge data set of invasive species location data. And so for within New York State, for those tiers 2 through 4, we captained both iMap invasives and iNaturalist data. And then when we're looking at things that are in this tier 1, so they're not yet in New York State or yet in New York PRISM, but they're in the surrounding region, we did a 100-mile buffer around New York State. And for that, we tapped into iMap, iNaturalist, EdMaps, and the USGS non-indigenous aquatic species database. So I think we have a data set that's well over 1.5 million records once we get through this. And so you can imagine these data tiering runs can be quite intensive. I think once we do we have to set up a computer to do the population counts for these and just not touch it for a day or two because it's crunching through all this information. And so for the impacts, we rely heavily on the New York State invasiveness assessment ranks. And so these have been done for about 600 species for both ecological invasiveness and socioeconomic invasiveness. And so these have been a huge help in terms of getting at least that first cut of the data tier for what would be eligible to be on the tiers list. And then, of course, with the expert review process, that's when the experts can dig into whether or not, you know, something should be pulled into the list, even though it hasn't been ranked, or maybe they disagree with the ranking. And so the expert review process can add additional and very important information to this process. And then, so for those population counts that we do, I guess I should mention that with that huge data set of locational data, we actually cluster each of those individual observation points for a particular species into populations using a 100-meter separation distance to account for, you know, multiple observations of the same population. And so that big data crunching that I mentioned, that the computers running overnight, that is getting the population counts for each of the species that are what we call eligible because they have a high socioeconomic or ecological rank, or they've been brought into the tier list by an expert review process in the past. So there's multiple ways, criteria for a species to land on this list in the first place. We compile these big spreadsheets for the expert review committees. And that expert review process so that's regional. So we send out the spreadsheets to the PRISM staff for each of those regions that we've run it on. And some PRISMs have a partner review committee. Some PRISMs do the expert reviewing internally. But we also have the state review process as well that convenes a work group of taxonomic experts across the state. And so what they are doing is taking those data tiers from that big spreadsheet of population counts and assessment ranks and so forth, and creating the expert tier. And from this, that is what we populate our invasive species tier table with. And so this is available online, and Mitch is going to give you an online demo here in a little bit. But we have this information that's updated on a regular basis, depending on when the PRISMs are able to review it and when we can get the data runs to the PRISMs. And also from this website, there's a link to another way of looking at the methods for this whole process, because I know it can get kind of complicated. Dylan Finley, who I'd mentioned was our master's student that worked on this project, he put together a story map that goes through the methods and also has some really cool artwork that he did for this project, and so you can find that there, linked from that site. All right, so with that, I'll turn it back over to Mitch.
Yeah, and just for a quick update of where we are in the process for this year. So this is something that we try to do annually. So using the data up through the 2023 field season, because the current tiers that are out there right now were, you know, set in 2023 based on 2022 data in previous. So we've updated the data and pulled the updated data from iMap and iNaturalist and run those population counts for each PRISM. And so now we're currently in the process of sending the results to PRISMs. So any PRISM folks on the call right now, you should expect those in your inbox in the next week or two. And then they go through expert review. And like Jen said, that can vary. So that varies from year to year and from PRISM to PRISM. So sometimes it's a more involved process where a committee is kind of convened and go through the tiers together as a group. And sometimes it's more of a quick internal review process to look for obvious changes and stuff. It kind of varies from year to year. Some PRISMs kind of alternate between more intense processes and then more quick processes in alternating years. And so that's where we're at right now. And then once the PRISMs are able to do that, they'll then have the option to update tiers if there are any species that need the tier to be changed. And so then we can publish those to the online table, which is available publicly. Next. And so now we'll hand it over to John to talk about how the tiers are kind of assigned and leveraged in the Catskills.
Thanks, Mitch. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Thompson, the director of the Catskill Regional Invasive Species Partnership, and I'd like to highlight some of the ways that we're using the invasive species tiers in CRISP. As Jennifer showed, at different times we had the top 10 priority species, the top 25. I think one advantage of this list I was thinking about when Jennifer was showing that was just that we're pretty much ranking all of the species, all the invasive species that we have in CRISP. So it gives us some information that we can share with others about why a certain species might be a tier 3 or tier 4, or definitely why it may not be a priority for what we're doing at CRISP. So and just overall, I'd say this methodology has really been a collaborative way to rank these species. It's been easy to update for us as the species change. And so this method has many advantages over the other methods that we've tried, where we would hire somebody from the outside that would give us a list, we'd work with it until it got outdated, hire somebody else, and so on and so forth. So it's been a real great benefit for us. Next slide. Jennifer showed this slide, I think, but just to highlight in dark green where the CRISP region is, and to point out, you can see our mission is on the left-hand side of the slide. This ranking system really helps us to achieve that mission, and that we can easily explain to people what species we're trying to prevent from getting here. That's a tier 1 species. What species we have here in low enough populations where we think that we can eradicate them by early detection and rapid response. That's the tier 2 species. So I would say that this method of ranking the species has been really advantageous for us in achieving our mission. Next slide. To zoom in on the CRISP region a little more, you can see the region is outlined in red on the right-hand side of this map, with the Catskill blue line shown in blue there. So we're managing species over about a 3.3 million acre area. It's all of Otsego, Schoharie, and Delaware counties, most of Greene, Ulster, almost all of Sullivan County, and a little bit of Orange County, just to orient you where we are. Next slide. Jennifer showed this already, but I just wanted to point out that this is something that we use at the PRISM level to define what we're working on. And also want to point out here that originally when we started this process, we got the information from iMaps from Jennifer on the different species that were in CRISP. We met with a group of experts. I think we had 4 experts at the original review, looking at where those species should be within the different tiers. And I'd also point out that we are, when you look at this graph, we're basically spending most of our time on the left-hand side of the graph. Those are our priorities that we're working on. We're working on trying to prevent new species from getting here, and we're trying to determine what are the tier 2 species, the ones that are in low enough populations that we could have a feasible goal of eradicating. So those are the priorities that we're working on. And just to emphasize the tier 2 a little bit, so in order to eradicate them, we would have to have a good methodology, good treatment methods that would work. We would have to have a certain capability or capacity to be able to work on the species and eradicate them over time. Next slide. This is from our website. Again, it's kind of the same definition, talking about that tier 2, our goal is eradication. We need to we expect that these populations are in low abundance, and that we would have an opportunity to eradicate them with proper management, if there's proper management available to impact their population. Next slide. And to see right here, you can see the terrestrial tier 2 species that we have in CRISP and the aquatic tier 2 species. The map on the right shows, and the larger dots, the yellow ones to red ones, those are where we have the tier 2 species in CRISP. So you can see that they're kind of widespread across the map. And I think that this, by using these tiers, it gives us a good opportunity to be able to manage across this large landscape. The green dots are the non-tier 2 species that we're working on. But just to point out a few of the species that we're working with, giant hogweed, we've made a lot of progress on over the last almost 10 years now. Mile-a-minute, we've made some good progress on areas that we've managed, but as I'll show you in a second, populations continue to pop up. We're also managing and surveying for Japanese angelica tree, Japanese tree lilac, Japanese hops, black jet bee, beauty bush, hardy kiwi was a new species a couple years ago, and winter creeper was a new species last year. The two aquatic species that we have here, frogbit, we only found in CRISP a few years back, and yellow floating heart a couple years back. We found it through surveys. So because they're high priorities, these tier 1 and tier 2s, as we're out in the field, we're surveying for them. And then when we're finding them, we're coming up with a plan for management and trying to manage them. Next slide. Whoop. Yeah, this is it. So just to show you some of the results from last year, we surveyed over 6,000 acres. Whenever we're surveying, if we find a tier 1 or tier 2, we're gonna mark it in pretty much any invasive species that's a high priority. We're gonna map where it is. And then we managed over 52 acres last year. The little picture, it's hard to see on the right. That's the brittle naiad that we found last year. So that was the tier 1 species. It became a tier 2 because we found it in CRISP. There's only one population that we know of so far, but we're going to continue to survey, and if there's feasible management option there, then we could potentially do management. And a little bit of success with mile a minute. We had a 52% decrease in cover of mile a minute from 2022 to 2023. But in the next section, the new sites that we found in 2023 include 3 new sites for mile a minute. We found a new site for winter creeper at Callicoon. We also found a new site for both Japanese hops and European frogbit. So as we're doing more surveys for these high priority species, we're finding more high priority species, which you would expect. We're also doing education, outreach, raising awareness about these species. The tier 1 and tier 2s are generally included in pretty much every program that we're doing. So as the public is able to recognize these species, we're getting more reports from the public about some of these species. Next slide. I think we first started this in 2018, Jennifer, maybe it was 2017, but just to show you some of the changes that we have done in the species list. Originally, giant hogweed was a tier 3. It's moved up to a tier 2 because we have less populations than we had a few years ago. Thanks to good management, we only have 2 sites that have giant hogweed that we're managing now. hopefully at some point we'll be able to eradicate it, but that takes a certain period of time, but we're on our way there. Then there's other species that have kind of like expanded, fallen off the table as we found more populations, or for the example of lesser celandine, we had really large populations that once we started surveying for it, we found that they were huge and went across properties that couldn't be managed and things like that. And wineberry, we found new populations of. Then, as I mentioned earlier, we have some species that obviously they'll move from tier 1, where they're prevention, they're not in CRISP, to tier 2 when we actually find them in CRISP, and that's from doing good surveys and getting reports from people. Through our own surveys, we've found brittle naiad, like I mentioned earlier, European frogbit, hardy kiwi was reported to us from some people that had planted it originally, and it kind of grew out of control, and then they reported that they needed help. So we showed up there to manage it. Next slide. The tiered species list is also really important for our request for proposals. Every year at CRISP, we get funding, and we subcontract with organizations that we want to help us to meet our priorities for CRISP, and those priorities are always doing early detection, rapid response for tier 1 and tier 2 species, surveying for those species in those different tiers, and doing rapid response for any tier 2 species that we found, and also raising awareness about tier 1 and tier 2 species. If somebody submits a proposal that addresses the pathways and spread, and doing outreach and education about that, then those would give them points in the scorecard where we rank all of our proposals. And as an example of an award, this year we gave the CRISP RFP award to the Otsego County Conservation Association for aquatic invasive species rapid responders in Otsego County. So that's a good example of how the tiered list works for us. Next. And just to kind of summarize and wrap up, we've been using the CRISP tiers to set priorities for management. Originally, we were seeking more advice from experts and meeting with them to try to come up with that list. More recently, in the last year or so, it's been more among our staff. The list, our list at least, has changed less as we've gone through time. But as we get more changes, we'll probably bring experts back in to advise us on where we should rank some of these species. And so it's a collaborative process, and also it's really important that we do horizon scanning, use the information that Jennifer has collected, or iMaps has collected, and to try to look at those, what are the important tier 1 species that we really want to focus on among our staff, among our partners, and to the public through our education programs. We want to make the information available and transparent. So it's been easy to do that through the tiered species list, saying that our priorities at CRISP are going to be the tier 1 and tier 2 species. And when people ask us questions or come to us with the tier 3 or tier 4 species, we might provide them with best management practices so that they can work on them, but it might not be something that we're working on. But when we are working on invasive species management plans for our partners and other organizations that we work with, we've used the tiered species list to help to define what our management goals are, and help people to understand by pointing to the tiered list, like this is the tier 3, so we expect this would be the best way to manage this species here at your park or preserve. This is an adaptive process. We're always getting new introductions. We need to redefine the list as we get that information. We're also getting some species we're eradicating populations, so we're able to move species from one tier to another based on there being less populations of it. And as we're doing surveys, we have new findings, so we continue to find populations of tier 2 species, and if it gets to if they get beyond our capacity to manage them, then they might move from a tier 2 to tier 3. We've continued to adapt our management with the new info that we get into the tiered species list. And as I mentioned earlier, we're using that information to define our request for proposals, priorities, and help our partners understand what our priorities are and help us to achieve those priorities. My contact information is there if anyone has any questions that are, if they'd like to be in touch with me. And thanks for your time. I'll pass it back to these folks.
Awesome. Thanks, John. That was great. If anybody has any questions for John or for anything that Jen said as well, please feel free to put those in the chat box. And yeah, thanks so much, John, for sharing that and for showing how useful the tiers can be. And so for the last part of the presentation today, I was just going to show a couple of the online resources and how you can kind of use the tiers and also use them in conjunction with iMap. And so the three main things will be the online tiers table, a new mapping option we have, and also email alerts is one thing that I've seen a lot of people leverage the tiers for. So to start with the online tiers table, I'll actually just hop over to the interface, and you guys are seeing that, right? Okay. So here's the tiers table that Jen mentioned earlier, and to get here, I often find like the fastest thing to do is just to type in MYMHP tiers in Google or something like that. But it's on our main web page, and you can find it on the data and maps page in the species tiers and prioritization section. So you can always find it there as well. So it has some overview if you ever need a refresher, but the main thing is going to be the, actually one thing that might be useful to look at in particular if you need a refresher is this official definitions PDF here. But the main thing will be using the online table, and so it's just this big list of lots of species with lots of different information on all the species. So in many cases, it's useful to use some of these filters on this table. So for example, if you're interested in a particular PRISM, if you're doing terrestrial work versus aquatic work, if you're focusing on plants, or if you're doing everything, and if you want to look at a particular tier group, you can kind of filter the list down on any of those options. And just to give an example, let's say you're kind of straddle capital region and CRISP, so maybe you're interested in both. You're kind of mostly focusing on some emerging species that are known in the region, so maybe tier 2s. You can kind of filter down the list there. Maybe you're focused on just terrestrial plants. And so just some notes about how the filter works. So it works as an OR filter generally. So like I'm filtered on tier 2 and capital region and CRISP, but it'll show you species that are tier 2 in either of those regions. So it doesn't show you things that are like just tier 2 in all the regions you select or something like that. And if you want to see that sort of information, you can use the sort buttons to sort things to just to go in order of the tiers. And so for sorting, it's these little up and down arrows. And you can do multiple sorts by shift doing a shift and click so you can sort on multiple things. And I also often find it easiest to show more entries. So for instance, once you have it filtered down and it's not hundreds of species, I often just switch it to all so that I can see everything I'm looking for in one page. And we don't have like an easy option for exporting the lists at this point. We just kind of, we don't want there to be like too many, you know, static spreadsheets out there on everyone's desktops, and then the tiers change, and then there's still like all these old versions out there. But if you are just trying to like create a quick watch list for your area or something, and you like filter on tier 2 species and you want a list of species names and stuff, you can just, you know, copy and paste. So you can just copy this into your own table. We try not to make that too easy to make sure that we don't get a bunch of out-of-date tiers out there. But feel free to use these as you see fit. And then one thing I wanted to highlight was this species tiers maps by PRISM link. So when you click that, it brings you to a new page, and it kind of explains the concept, but briefly, so in iMap, we track hundreds of species, and in every PRISM, there's, you know, dozens of species in each tier, and there's no, like, field for tier in iMap species records. So there's, like, no within iMap programmed way to kind of get at the tiers. And so if someone, say, wants to look at a map of all the tier 2 species in their PRISM, previously they would have to, you know, go into the filter tool and type in the individual species, and it was a very manual process. And so to make that a little bit more streamlined, we generate these kind of free pre-filtered map links. So for instance, if you want to see all the tier 2 species in Lower Hudson, you can click on this, and it will bring up a map that shows you the tier 2 reports in the Lower Hudson on the map. And so I'll show an example for CRISP. So for tier 2, click on that link, it'll bring you right to this map, and it's pre-filtered. It looks kind of similar to what John was showing earlier, because that's kind of showing the same thing wherever the tier 2 species are reported. And again, this is all the tier 2 species. So if we were looking at a single tier 2 species, we would expect it to be, you know, even less reports within the region. But when you have them all on there, you can see that they do kind of light up all across the region. And you can see they're much more common in surrounding regions. That's the tier 2 map, and if you click the tier 4 map, it looks like this. And so these are species, you know, like Phragmites and honeysuckles and those sorts of things, which are, you know, much more widespread. So that's one way you can kind of connect the tiers into how you use iMap. Another way that I've seen people, particularly PRISM staff, use is, so in iMap you can set up email alerts. You can do those for particular species you're interested in and regions you're interested in. And I've seen several PRISM staff, you know, make alerts for all their tier 2 terrestrial plants, and then have a separate alert for their tier 1s or something like that. And so this is one place where, since tiers are not directly in iMap, we don't really have a streamline option for that. So at this point, setting alerts for specific tiers, that is something that still needs to be done manually. So you would have to go into your alert and type in each species to get those alerts. But I guess the good news is that you kind of just have to do that once a year whenever the tiers are updated. And then for that entire year, iMap is going to automatically query the database just for those species once a week or once a day, however you set it up, and pull out those records for you. So still kind of have to spend some time setting up the initial alert, but the benefit is that it kind of does it automatically for you for the whole year. And just show you quickly in the email alerts. You can also do, for kind of the new emerging species, like maybe tier 2 in your region or tier 1 in your region, you can also do, if you go into location, first time in county district. So in a lot of cases, those will be species that are kind of newer in your area. So that's one easy way without having to type in individual species, that you can kind of think about species in this way in your email alerts. And with that, I'll just give another quick update. So with all that context, now where we are is we're sending out the results from the population count analysis to PRISMs for them to review. And then over the next few months, there might be some updates to what's on the online table right now. And so we'll publish those updates once those are available. And I'd just like to thank everyone for attending, and also just to our presenters, to Jen and to John, and to the whole PRISM network and everyone who has helped us get to this point with the species tiers. It's been a long iterative process and a lot of brainstorming amongst people who are working in very different regions and trying to come up with this framework that can be applied to a lot of different scenarios.